Don't do it, man. What an ice hole. Action heroes of history. Adventure Man, John D. Craig. First of all, I want to make a shout out to Nathan Salas. He sent me some photos of John D. Craig's animal trophy collection that I will be showing you in upcoming videos. Just a quick sample of what's to come. Here is a leopard that John had prepared by a world-famous taxidermist in South India. More about this and John's other trophies in episodes to come. Thanks, Nathan. When we last left John, he had become an oil millionaire. What to do with all that money? Why, bum around the world, of course. The next 2.5 years were wild for John D. Craig, and it almost got him dead in the desert. All of this takes place roughly between 1922 to 1925. Alaska. One thing that John found he had in common with his late father was the restlessness of his youth. He really couldn't stay in one place too long. If we were to dig into John's psychology, this may have been due to the fact that when he was very young he moved from Ohio to Canada, then to California. He went from being such an active youngster to quite sickly for a good part of his formative years. Then his family had become poor. John had been hindered, and he didn't like it at all. So when he got money and could afford to have no responsibilities, why not live it up? John and his oil partner / sidekick Jacko Osborne set out from California to Alaska. It seemed like a natural choice for John's first destination. When he was a very young child, during happier times, he lived in Canada and had fun in the colder climate. During stressful times in California, he went to the mountains to do what he wanted to do. Something about Alaska enchanted John. Most people would probably pick a warmer location, but that was John's thing. Jacko was almost like a father figure to John. He didn't try to push his wisdom on the young adventurer, but he was very much a guiding light, and John did seem to take value in Jacko's personal knowledge about things. Alaska was quite an eye-opener for John. He discovered that he didn't like it quite as much as he thought he was going to. Certainly not long enough to become a sourdough. A what? Sourdough is a term for someone who has lived in Alaska for many winters. It started in the very late 19th century during the Klondike Gold Rush. Prospectors and settlers who came to Alaska would bring their own starter kit, including sourdough bread, with them. A key to surviving in Alaska was making that sourdough bread last as long as possible. If you were an experienced Alaskan, you were called a sourdough. It's a good thing. On the flip side, if you were an Alaskan newbie, you were a Chichaco. John Craig and Jacko Osborne were Chichacos. This term also developed around the same time as sourdough. The word itself comes from the Chinook language of the Pacific Northwest. Both of these terms are still used today and are distinctly Alaskan. John didn't consider being a sourdough a great honor. The sourdoughs told him that something happens to a man who stays in Alaska too long. They can't pull themselves away. They called this the Great White Silence. He wasn't about to let that happen to him. Before he left Alaska, however, John had a lot of adventures. He dug a gold nugget out of the ground with his own hands. He crossed living glaciers. A story John heard is what finally got him to leave Alaska. A man who had gone missing for 25 years was found inside a glacier, perfectly preserved. He was totally dead, but hadn't aged a day. There was no advancement at all, just a suspension in time. So they sent the man home for burial. John didn't want anything like that to happen to him. He wanted to live a full life, and Alaska wasn't going to do it for him. The next stop on John's world tour? England. John and Jacko sailed to England. Shortly after their arrival, Jacko had fallen ill. John's old friend had to go into a nursing home. While in Jacko's room, John heard a timid little knock on the door. He opened it, and there she was, Nurse Sunny. Romancing the Nurse. Sunny was a very attractive Australian girl. In at least one way, she was like John. Sunny was working her way around the world to get out of a rut in Sydney. Jacko wasn't in the nursing home for long, and soon the jovial pair were off to parts unknown in Europe. John and Sunny, however, had become very close from the start. John and Jacko would return to London on a regular basis to visit Sunny. They took her to the Derby, the tennis matches at Wimbledon, Ranelagh, Ascot, and the theaters. A romance was blossoming. Sunny very definitely had her sights set on John. She was 8 years older than him and wanted to marry. John certainly wasn't as emotionally mature and had no intention of marrying at this point in his life. It would come to a head later on, but for now, the two just had fun. The European Tour. John and Jacko were having a good time. John has even referred to this time period as pleasant years, despite the great unrest in the countries through which they traveled. Mussolini's march on Rome was something John wouldn't forget. As a matter of fact, neither would Italy or the rest of the world. It was a major historical event. From October 27th to the 31st in 1922, Benito Mussolini led his fascist party in black-shirt paramilitary, which was a voluntary militia, on an invasion of the city of Rome. On October 30th, the king simply transferred power to Mussolini to avoid armed conflict. The next day, the black-shirts paraded around Rome in celebration. John and Jacko were almost arrested. Why? Some American girls had put red carnations in their buttonholes. Sounds harmless, right? Well, the two were grabbed by soldiers because red was the color of communist Russia. After they assured the government-appointed bullies that they weren't Russian, they had to take the flowers out. The two were also at President Hindenburg's inauguration in Germany. This occurred on May 12, 1925. John was amazed at how many armed policemen were at the event. There were more policemen here than Germany was allowed to have soldiers under the Versailles Treaty, signed to end World War I in 1919. John also got to meet the Pope. He saw a bullfighter get killed in Spain by a bull. He even visited the battlefields of France. At some point in 1925, John was in Paris, France by himself. Jacko stayed in London. As it would turn out, Jacko was wise for doing so. Maybe John should have done the same. One good thing came out of his Paris adventures, however, but it seemed so minor at the time. The minor, major life-changing event. John was young and all by himself in Paris. He wasn't an idiot by any means, but he wasn't wise to the ways of the world. Jacko really should have been with him, but if he had, John may not have done the next thing that set his life in motion. It seemed so trivial at the time. There was no way John could have known the implications of such a minor purchase. A Frenchman had sold him an old motion picture camera from 1913 made by the Path Company. John didn't really want to buy it, but he was badgered into the sale. At the time, John didn't think he would get much use out of it. This became another example of how poor a prophet he would have been. John's camera work would ultimately become the biggest reason he is known to us today. If John had just gone to Paris, bought the camera, and left, he would have been better off. Everything else that happened just led to trouble. Fun with French girls. John was staying at Pension Sylvabelle, a finishing school for French young ladies. A French woman was able to get John in there as a paying guest. How, he never found out. The lady who ran the school considered his presence a boon, like a special course in romance. John spent his days filming the girls with his new old camera and trying out his French on them. He was getting especially good with the camera, but he had the proper inspiration. John got good at taking pictures and building sequences. He could develop, cut, and assemble film. The young Mr. Craig was a quick study, at least when it came to the camera. Everything was fun and frolic, until Sonny arrived. Trouble in Paradise. Sonny was very much into John and wanted to marry him. At that point, John wasn't even interested in making her his steady. But the biggest fight they had concerned John's mode of living. You've heard of beach bums. Well, John was a world bum. That's what Sonny thought of him, although he didn't think of himself that way. Not at the time. Even while you are traveling, you should be doing something, building something, getting ready for a career, she said. If only she knew what was to come with John and his movie camera. I'll show her I'm not a bum, by God, he thought to himself. I'm gonna get drunk. While at Charlie's bar. So far, we know John Craig has had a lot of adventure in his young life. He was not quite 23, and already he went from living in Canada to California, poor health that almost crippled him, the death of a parent, poverty, overwork, and a nervous breakdown, all before striking it rich. These last 2+ years, he explored Alaska and Europe, hooked up with a hot Australian nurse, and shacked up with a bunch of French girls. He would meet 2 men at the bar whose life stories made his look like baby poop. Both of them were American, and their names were Cooper and Shaw. They weren't that much older than him, but certainly had a long fight with trouble. A few years earlier, their families had sent them abroad. They blew all their money in Paris in a week. Paris has always had a way of separating dumb American tourists from their money. After that, Cooper and Shaw signed up as engineers for the Russian government. Russia wouldn't pay them for their work, and threatened them with death if they balked about it. So what did they do? They blew up their own work and fled the country. After Russia, the dynamic duo escaped into China and down to Siam, where they ran a newspaper. All was going well for a while, until they decided to back an unsuccessful political candidate. They made another hasty exit and went back north to Siberia. Cooper and Shaw hired themselves out as guides to an American scientific expedition hunting woolly tigers. They weren't finding any, so they set 6 trap guns. Even John, at the time, thought this was very unsportsmanlike and not cool. 3 of the trap guns went off the first night, and each brought down a kill. In the dim light of dawn, the members of the expedition discovered 3 dead Chinamen. Oops! The boys decided to hit the old dusty trail once again and snuck into Italy, then Germany, on expired passports before they were arrested. Germany sent them home on passports that allowed them to go through but one country on the way. They chose France and were still here. Personal opinion poll time. Okay, imagine yourself as a rich, young American guy. You've got all the money you'll ever need. On top of that, you've had just about all the kind of fun you could ever have. A hot nurse wants to marry you. If you didn't want to go back to America and live in sunny California, you could just as easy live in London or Paris. It's either this or hang out with 2 shady characters you met at a bar. What would be your choice? Remember, if you choose wrong, you will be judged. John's choice. John chose poorly. We're going to Timbuktu whether we've got passports or not, the pair told him. You want to go with us? Heck yeah, I want to go to Timbuktu, John replied. These are the kinds of decisions made by 3 drunks in a bar. Cooper and Shaw disappeared for 2 weeks, and John had forgotten about them. Then he got a telegram from them. They were in Algiers and asking why he was delaying the party. John wasted no time in packing up and heading out. Sonny's take on the whole situation. It wasn't good. She thought Cooper and Shaw sounded sketchy. Go figure. Women. John tried to make it sound flowery by saying he was finally trying to build a career, per her suggestion, and was going to get some good camera footage. Sonny gave him an ultimatum. If he went with these guys, she was through with him. She was going back to Australia. The choice for John was clear. He was going to Algiers. It's not all sunny days in the desert. John was now in Lagwat, a thriving desert community with a French military barracks and a modern flying field. Before we go any further in the desert, where exactly is Lagwat, and what's it all about? Lagwat is located in the country of Algeria, North Africa. It is south of the capital, Algiers, and on the north edge of the Sahara Desert. Lagwat is an oasis and also serves as an important administrative and military center and marketplace. You can also buy some really great rugs and tapestries there. So how come there were French people in North Africa, and why were the Arabs so mad about it? Once upon a time, the Ottoman Turks, also called the Ottoman Empire or the Turkish Empire, controlled Algeria. As a matter of fact, the Turks controlled much of Southeast Europe, Western Asia, and Northern Africa from the 14th to early 20th centuries. The Ottoman Empire lost control of the country of Algeria. In 1516, they had established it as a province of the empire, but over time, control of Algeria was handed over to the country of Morocco. By 1710, Morocco no longer recognized the Ottoman Empire as having any part of Algeria. Before the French came into the area in 1830, Algeria was under Moroccan control. The Ottoman Empire had treated the Arabs cruelly on every level imaginable. Arabs hated Turks. Moroccan rule was just a continuation of their misery. They weren't going to embrace the French either. Just so we don't start thinking Arabs were the only victims here, they themselves took over North Africa from the Berbers. Who are the Berbers? They are the native people of North Africa who were taken over by the Arabs in the 7th century. They too had their culture drained from them. All this fighting and invading of other lands gets people nowhere. I mention the Berbers because they play a part in France's colonization of Algeria. France now controlled Algeria. They had their eyes on other Saharian territories as well. The Arabs and Berbers really resented it, so a lot of French people got massacred. By this time, a lot of Berbers and Arabs were of like mind, even sharing religion, so yeah, they didn't like the French. Originally, the two races had common ground to unite against the French. The French felt turnabout was fair play, so in 1852 they invaded the city of Lagwat. Their massacring was much better than what the Arabs and Berbers had been doing. This really isn't a commendable trait, but wow did the French do a good job of wiping out their enemy, about 2/3 of Lagwat's population. It was an ultimate show of force. Clearly, they won. But why did France win so completely? And how did they maintain control of Lagwat and the rest of Algeria until 1962? Rising to power is one thing. Maintaining it is quite another. The Arabs and Berbers knew they got beat. That didn't mean they couldn't get together and fight the French again. To ensure that didn't happen, the French government purposely and skillfully engineered racial tensions between the Arabs and Berbers, the old divide and conquer technique. France actually did research and hired sociologists and scientists to see what made these people tick and what would get them ticked off at each other. The Berbers weren't treated spectacular, but they were given opportunities by the French that were not extended to the Arabs. This in turn made the Arabs very spiteful of the Berbers. There was political infighting and outright conflict. In addition, most of the schools were shut down, so only about 10% of Algerians were literate. It was France's plan in keeping the locals mad at each other and good and stupid. This next bit I'm going to tell you isn't social or political commentary. It's just what it is. This technique is still being used today, throughout the world. Everyone can be friendlier with other people than we have been. Every bit of dissension you show towards someone else just because profits someone else who is richer and more powerful than you. Don't fall into the trap. Back to John's story. Perhaps John's first indicator that this trip wasn't a good idea was the quote-unquote real hoochie-coochie dance he saw when he got to Lagwat. This was about the dullest thing he had ever seen. The girl wore more clothes than an Arctic explorer. All she did was shuffle around in a circle and raise clouds of dust. Lame. He traveled southwest from there into the real desert. At night, John and his crew slept on the sand in bags under the stars. Things were pretty uneventful. Then came the evening of the third day. Riff-raff. It was dusk, and the party John was with set up camp. The air was getting cold, so they immediately built a fire. They saw other fires way across the sand, so they knew they weren't alone in the desert. Still, it was a bit of a surprise when they saw a half-dozen Arab camel riders coming their way. The Arabs dismounted and were armed with rifles. It was clear to John they were ready to use their guns if they felt the need. They spoke to John's party in French. Since the driver of John's party was fluent in French, he served as the spokesman. John was surprised with the leader of the Arabs. He was a tall, good-looking guy with white teeth, as handsome as any Hollywood actor. This guy started talking with their driver in Arabic. The driver turned to the rest of the group and explained. He brings a message from his chief, requesting that we accept the hospitality of his camp. Sounded harmless enough. Good idea, right? Tell him we'll be right over, John instructed his driver. Come on, boys, here's a chance to see a real sheik. John headed towards his car. An Arab gently put a hand on his shoulder. The chief requested we leave our car here and walk over there, the driver explained to John. Okay, John thought to himself. This isn't getting weird yet. He went to the car and grabbed his movie camera and some flares. John really wanted to get that sheik on film, even if it was at night. Once again, that same Arab put a hand on his shoulder. Explain to them that this gadget is harmless, John told his driver. The driver just shook his head. I think we'd better leave the camera here and not offend these people. These men are Riffs. The Riffs tribe were at odds with the French Foreign Legion, and there was something of a war going on. John felt sure, as did his buddies Cooper and Shaw, that as American citizens they were safe. However, the camera stayed behind, and John's party decided to play it cool. One time, at Riff Camp, there were 50 Riffs in the camp, mostly men. They had a lot of camels and ponies. The chief welcomed John's group in French and bowed, asking them to sit down. They sat in a circle. The women brought over a huge white metal tray. It was 3 feet in diameter and 2 inches deep. Piled high on the tray was couscous, covered with chunks of boiled goat meat. It wasn't exactly good, and John hated it, but he and his guys had been eating worse. They all, very bravely, picked at the tray with their fingers and ate the stuff. John had all of the couscous with goat he could stand and moved back. He tried to signify that he had eaten all he could. The chief smiled and waved his hand toward the dish, inviting him to eat more. "You'd better keep eating," the driver told him. "The Rifts think that if you don't eat to the bottom of the tray, you don't like it. It's an insult to leave any." In English, John asked the driver, "How do I know it isn't poisoned?" The chief looked at John, smiled, then in perfect English, with an Oxford accent, he said, "It is quite harmless, and surely you would not offend me by refusing my humble offering." Well, that was 3 languages the Arabs knew. John went to work on the tray again and finally got down to the last morsel. Then, the women came over and heaped even more food on the tray. John ate some more, but finally reached his limit and really couldn't swallow another bite. Even if they were going to kill him, he was through eating. The chief then said something to his lieutenants in Arabic, and they all started to laugh. What was so funny? The driver, Cooper, and Shaw were still picking away at the tray. Mr. Driver got up, quickly walked away, and started swearing to himself. The driver may have known some Arabic language, but he knew little about Rif customs. It was not an insult to leave any food on the tray. Actually, the Rifts considered it a sign of ill breeding to eat it all. When the women brought over more food, it was so John and his men could save face. John and his crew were too full and queasy to laugh. After the tray was taken away, the chief began to question them about things they knew nothing about. He wanted to know about the strength of the Foreign Legion's forces, what they were doing, and where they were at. It was clear that the Rifts thought these men were French spies. They totally weren't, but here is what made things sticky. There were, in fact, 2 Frenchmen in John's party. One was scared to death and the other was drunk. Without their presence, John and the guys may have been left alone, but this convinced the chief they were spies. "Why did you come into the desert without an official guide?" asked the chief. "We were looking for motion picture subjects," Cooper explained. The chief didn't believe them and insisted they stay the night. Furthermore, he told them that they were moving camp in the morning and that he would be delighted to have them accompany him. The educated and extremely cautious Rif made things very plain to John and his party. "We cannot run the risk of revealing our movements. If we were to allow you to go, there is a possibility that you would give our position away. It is better that you remain with us. Fetch what clothing you need from your car. We will regard you as our guests and make you as comfortable as possible, but I advise you not to attempt to leave us." Stuck between a sand dune and a hard place. It took John a long time to realize the danger he was in. The graciousness of his hosts and suave manners fooled him. John and his party was forced to wander the desert with their captors for 11 days. They set up camp after camp, resting in the tents by day and traveling at sunset until darkness. At night, they all sat around the fire listening to storytellers and Riffian songs. The Rifts were trying to evade the Foreign Legion patrols, but at the same time, were looking for them in order to attack. In one way, John and his guys wanted to be rescued. They knew, however, that if the Legion showed up, the Rifts would absolutely believe they were spies and probably kill them on the spot. If the Rifts didn't kill them, they may have just gotten killed in the fighting that would take place. One thing was for sure, John didn't want to see any Foreign Legion soldiers at any time while he was with the Rifts. John was missing Sunny terrible. He realized that she had been right about him taking this trip, and that he wasn't the grand adventurer he thought he was. There was no direction or purpose to this trip, a mistake he wasn't going to make again if he got out of this. Maybe he did need to settle down like his father finally did. This wasn't cool. He did get some education out of the experience. Incredibly, he figured out that Arabs weren't his enemy, and he didn't hate them, even if they were going to kill him. They had their own way of living, and were simply just trying to live, like everyone else in the world. It was the first time he had seen people of a different religious faith. John saw how Mohammedanism governed the lives of these people far more than Christianity did for his people. He also got to ride the camels and Arabian horses. They were fun, but not very fast. Then one evening, the chief announced to John and his party that the danger was past and their visit could end. He gave them Arab ponies, saddled and ready, and pointed to a star. If you will follow that star for 3 hours, you will come to a road which will lead you back to Algiers. I am sorry to have detained you in this way, but you will appreciate, I am sure, that there was no alternative. In Algiers, when John and his guys came to Algiers, they learned that their disappearance was a big to-do. He also found out that the driver left a note in their abandoned car, saying they had been taken by Rifts. A searching party was sent to look for them, but were unsuccessful. Had the searching party found John's group, they would have been killed. John was able to get back his clothes and camera from the car. His trophy from this trip was going to be some awesome camera footage, and he got zip. It was the end of the road for Cooper and Shaw. The parents of the international troublemakers arrived in Paris. They heard about the escapade and wired to the American consul in Algiers that if the boys were found, they were to be thrown in jail and held until further notice. Their mommies and daddies apparently had enough. Cooper and Shaw were, in fact, arrested as soon as they and John had checked into a hotel. Meanwhile, John was left behind to read a telegram from Jacko Osborne. Jacko had arrived in Marseille, France, and was ready to come look for John if he hadn't turned up. John immediately wired Jacko that he was coming to Marseille. Cooper and Shaw were about to be totally reamed by their parents, and he didn't want to be anywhere in sight. On the boat to Marseille, John realized he had grown cocky and foolish during his long, extended vacation. He spent a lot of money, and had nothing to really show for it. Sonny was right, and he was glad he didn't have to face her when he got off the boat. In his own words, he felt like an ass. The adventure continues. John's covered a lot of ground in his young life, but his saga is just spooling up. Jacko's back in the picture, and John conquers the pyramids of Egypt. Is there anything to repair between John and Sonny? And how does a beautiful British girl named Frida factor into his next adventure? Will he ever give himself that middle initial? The life of John D. Craig is a wild ride, and I hope you're enjoying it, bumps and all. Join me next time as we take another spin in the life of this true action hero of history.
Thank you.